Hi. So yeah, I'm Zinzi Minott if you're French. If you're not, Minott is fine. It's alright, it happens all the time. Yeah, so the sound you were just listening to is part of the process that we used to make the sugar yesterday, and that was what we were doing in the workshop. There's various ways of making sugar, and the kind of way that we chose to do it yesterday is an amalgamation of me doing a lot of Google research and then kind of swimming blindly and things that I thought were also aesthetically interesting. So you could just put the sugarcane in a juicer, that's perfectly possible, and then boil it, but instead we pounded it and we squeezed it and used lots of cloths and tried to find a process that was practical as well as interesting, not just like a functional process. Some things I should probably tell you. So I guess in terms of like the context of my work, I'm very interested in sugar, but I'm also interested in water. I'm interested in coffee, and these are the products that have been around me historically from childhood. My uncle lives on a sugarcane field, so I partly grew up across from a sugarcane field when I was spending time in Barbados. My father's from Tanzania, so coffee is extremely important. But these products, what I like about them is that they offer a way of having very big conversations, very heavy, often splitting conversations with people, and they're quite honest. The history of sugar is quite a clear one in terms of the damage and the pain that surrounds that, and I think often that is something people don't want to admit, but when you put a product in place, then that conversation becomes a little easier, which maybe is sad, but I definitely find that to be the truth, and that's kind of how I use these things. The laughing that you heard on the recording is the three people are going to come up now who I worked with yesterday, and that's Holly, Emmanuel, and Chani, and also Shanice is working with me and assisting me on this project, and they've all been really amazing, and we wouldn't have been able to do it. So one of the things that I think is also important to explain, when we spoke yesterday about what we wanted to present publicly, the workshop was intentionally closed. We wanted to have conversations that had the potential to get quite difficult and quite painful, and we didn't think that should be received publicly. We wanted that at some point to be able to be public. And in the process of thinking about what we would do, one of the things we said that we needed to be very clear is that we weren't trying to do a reenactment of what it was to make sugar at the time of slavery. That's not something we're interested in, also something we couldn't do. But what we were interested in is what we felt and how we felt whilst we made sugar. So that was something that we said we wanted to make very clear. So I think we're going to have a chat. I'm going to let you guys kind of like have a chat with us, and then we'll open up for questions. So that's kind of the structure of it, and then we have some stuff to give you, and that's pretty much how it's going to roll. So we have some leading questions that we were kind of working with that we're going to speak about, and I'll just tell you them now, and then we're going to just talk. So the first question was, how did you feel making the sugar? The next one is, how did your body feel? The third one was, how would you think about the movement you used making the sugar? How would you talk about that? And did you find any physical sustainability? So we have one mic, so we can just pass it around. So.
Hi, I'm Chantal. Just starting with the first question of how did you feel making the sugar? I feel that when we first started, we were quite inquisitive. We weren't sure how to. We knew like the process, but we weren't quite sure how to go about it, how to whittle down like the specificity of it all. I feel like.
Hi, I'm Emmanuel. It's hard to actually answer these questions separately now that I'm thinking about them, because, which I think is testament to the questions, because they're also related. But in terms of how I felt, I think one thing for me was kind of separating the history of sugar from the activity. Like I think I was aware that it could have been traumatic or it could have been a difficult thing to do, but there was something about the fact that it required a lot of energy and activity that you couldn't really focus on that history so much for me. In a good way, like we had the time to think about it and relate it back to histories of slavery and colonialism, but there was something about the activity itself that meant you were so focused on your body, so.
Yeah, I agree. I think I was thinking about that as well, that separation between kind of thinking about the histories and legacies of this very loaded product and, you know, in day-to-day cooking or making a cake, I don't tend to kind of dwell on that kind of past and also the present that surrounds us because of it. But I think within the workshop, I felt like I was constantly fluctuating between sort of, yeah, that physical kind of process, and you had the laughter, like it was an enjoyable process working together and trying to figure out how to kind of squeeze the juice out and stuff. And then like thinking about this kind of direct relationship to the conversations that I guess all of your current work is kind of circulating around. So yeah.
Hi. Yeah, I think it is strange actually, because when I was doing it, I think partly because so much of the process is unknown, whether it's unknown because I hadn't done it with people or because I haven't done it enough to understand the variables of what I'm doing. Like it's not something I've mastered and I've done repetitively, so things kept shifting. Like say for example, that we cooked it in a Dutch pot, which has a very specific like relationship to capturing heat. For those who don't know, a Dutch pot, I'm gonna make like maybe a slightly generalizing statement, but I think roughly correct, can be called like a Caribbean, Anglophone Caribbean cooking pot. I think like a lot of Anglophone Caribbean islands use this pot to cook with, and it's called a Dutch pot. It actually got into the Caribbean via Holland. Beyond that, I don't know its history, but I know that that's how it got there. It has a similar status in the house as a skillet might have in like an African American context, or a chapati pan if your house makes chapatis or rotis. It's got a very specific status in the kitchen, but also it captures heat in a really specific way, and it gets really hot. So when we'd done it before, it just didn't happen so quickly, and the pot in here, it just burned. And there was smoke in the kitchen, it was dreadful, like, we couldn't get it out. So all these things were happening, it's like alchemy, trying to do this like magical process, and then you're like, oh, the politic, and then like you've got this rhythm going with these sticks, and you know, if you catch a beat with somebody, it's a nice thing to do. So then we just all broke out in laughter, and then you're like, oh yeah, the thing. So it wasn't just like down the straight line of crying and misery and heaviness, which I think actually surprised me. I thought it was going to be a lot more like emotionally taxing than actually it ended up being. Yeah.
So in terms of how it made my body feel, it was quite tiring. We started with like breaking the killings, and then like pounding it in these like the pestle and water pots, and literally we'd get tired and then pass it on to the next one, like, oh, do you want to have a go? And then I think the most difficult bit, well for me at the start, was the squeezing of the cake to actually get the like juice out. It was actually really difficult for me, especially we had to work out like making it small enough to actually get your hands around it, and then we worked out a new option with the spoon. So it was just working out all those different kind of like options to make it easier on our bodies, because it was quite a difficult task.
Yeah, I think it was interesting because there were so many different aspects of making the sugar. Like you said, like we had to cut it, we had to squeeze it. Like there were different parts of our bodies always being worked at, and then we also got into like a really interesting like group dynamic of like two people would be like pounding it on the pestle and mortar, then the next two people would be squeezing it, but then we'd also rotate, and like there was this weird like our bodies were getting into some sort of rhythm, and then we were also like as a group not even really like we weren't thinking okay you're better at this so you should do that, but like we naturally had like specific roles, but then we'd take breaks and then someone would take over, so like it was a weird like it wasn't just like individual bodies for me, it was like all of our bodies were like weirdly, it was like a machine, and like another thing that struck me was like with the rhythm there was something like there's so much potential in that, because like you said, like you get into a rhythm and then like Shanice started like would make it into a song, like there was like potential in the actual movement, like it could become something else, like it could be a track, for example, like there was like in terms of how our bodies felt, there were like I don't know, our bodies were doing things, they were making things and all working together.
Yeah, definitely. I think that sort of communal energy was definitely present, and I guess it sort of overlaps. The questions all overlap, like you were saying, but about kind of how you felt about the movement as well. But there was something we started to talk about, but I don't feel like we properly kind of finished talking about it or developed it, but about sort of repetition, and obviously you can hear in that sort of pounding the repetition and all of the different sort of elements of or units of work that we used to extract the sugar were very repetitious, is that the word? But I think you started to talk about a little bit about your interest in repetition more broadly in your practice. I'm sort of interested to hear a bit more about that.
I'm obsessed with repetition. I love it. So I'm just I just find it. So I'm thinking about, you're obsessed about something and someone asks you, you're like, how much should I say? So I think the thing that I find interesting about repetition initially is that it's not really possible, and I think once I've really understood that, then I was like I know, just been going around and around about what you have to do, what your body does to present the same image again and again, like how many like micro changes, and I'm a dancer, like so a lot of the process of getting my work on the stage or in a place is repetitious, right? It's like drilling it again and again and again, and by the time you see it, it's the first time, but I've done it so many times, and within that time, my body is adapted to how hard it is, so then it does it better, and it shifts, and like you start to make shortcuts. If the arm's supposed to do this, eventually the arm starts doing that because it's quicker, and that's why you have a rehearsal director to say, no, it's like the full thing, right? So like your body's always like evolving and trying to fix things for you, and I think that's what interests me about repetition, like how you keep evolving within it, and then you're trying to give the same image, and it's not really happening, and you just keep getting better, so you kind of, I think that's probably enough for something I'm obsessed about. But I think in terms of this, like, we spoke about it yesterday with repetition, and like, potentially, when you're doing something over and over again, your mind can get freer, because you don't have to focus, and I think that's also what I like about it, like, because we were doing this for so long that there's a type of focus that you can maybe start to not have to have. If that makes sense, like if you're on the keyboard typing, after a while, if you know what you're doing, like you can think about what you're gonna have for dinner. Like you can start to do that because you're so familiar with the process you're doing. And I guess that did make me wonder, and this is maybe where it did get heavier for me, is that I did start to wonder if people who were enslaved, if that's where they had freedom, if the processes that they were doing were so brutal but also so repetitious, and their bodies were adapting and evolving to do them, was there this part of this mind that they could have an escapism through? And maybe I thought that because that's what I hoped, maybe that just was not possible, and that's like some romantic desire that I have for them, as opposed to something that was truly possible. But yeah, that's what I thought.
So linking the repetition into the movement that we had to make the sugar, I feel like we gradually became like more. At first, we weren't sure of what movement we needed to do, and then we found a movement to it, and then as a group, we kind of perfected that movement, and until we got a system that kind of worked. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess in terms of that, like sustainability, which, or maybe I'm jumping, yeah, physical sustainability. And, you know, speaking about repetitive movement and how you sort of become rhythmically sort of in tuned and then can almost tune out. I feel like there's inevitably a limit to that, isn't there? And it was really tiring. It was physically exhausting. It's hot. It was, and there's a level of endurance. But I feel like my level of endurance was that I could see that there was an end to it. So there was a diminishing pile, physically on the table of cane that we'd cut, and that was, I guess, that sort of. I couldn't help but make that connection, or sort of seeing that almost in response to what you're talking about with a sort of escapism or a level of freedom, is obviously a key difference, is having those sort of limits in place that are, yeah, opt-outable. Yeah.
That like something that all of you guys have said is coming out for me, is this idea of like there were so many disruptions that we would get into a rhythm, but then then someone spotted the smoke, for example, even though we were like kind of taking a break at that point, but there were disruptions that were beyond what we could plan for, or I don't know, so even as we did get into this rhythm, we were never fully in control. Really, I don't think. And partly that was because we didn't have the knowledge to be in control. Like, we also were testing, we were working things out, but yeah, there's something about that disruption. Is like, we didn't intend for there to be disruption. We didn't and they weren't necessarily bad. Like, disruption doesn't have to be bad. Like, they were fun. It was enjoyable. Like, even trying to get the smoke out of the room was really fun. And but yeah, it just felt good.
I think as well, in the freedom of our minds being freed during the repetition, we kind of started thinking about like trial and error, and we thought about the trial and error that we were making, but also like the trial and error of slavery, and it was really weird because we got like really deep into those thoughts because our minds were being freed.
Yeah, I promise this isn't going to be a lecture on repetition, but repetition is a part of a triptych that I've worked with for about 10 years, and it's repetition, duration, and exhaustion. And I thought by when you said about being tired that I hadn't said that, and that invariably, they have to keep having this relationship. Like, if you want to do something for a long time, then you start getting into a durational process, or like in my context, durational work, right? And but then you have to deal with like the limits of your body. So if I'm going to do a really difficult work, then it takes longer to make, not necessarily because it takes longer for me to think of the things I want to do, but it takes longer for me to train my body. I have to get my body really strong to do that particular thing, especially if it's like outside of the context of dance training. So like I train as a dancer regularly, but I don't pound sugar regularly. So if I wanted to do that for a day, like that's going to need a certain level of conditioning. And I think what's interesting about taking it into that context, of doing that as a creative, is that is not how people's bodies were conditioned, right? They were conditioned through the process, but also those who couldn't keep up were taking out. So whether that was because people died naturally or people were killed, if you couldn't maintain a certain level of duration, you were null and void. And I think it's interesting to think about that then as someone who's thinking creatively about that. Is that a respectful thing for me to play with? I would probably not put that on stage myself. I think for me I'm not comfortable with that. But yeah, I think it does raise issues about how like ultimately I'm doing this to have a conversation. Like I'm not doing this to mimic people, and I think this has to, I have to be really careful about that. And I do think, yeah, that maybe my identity gives me an ability to see some of that, but also I am not an enslaved person on a sugarcane field. I'm not, so I have to keep like going back and back and be like, is this actually okay? Like, are you doing the thing that you said you were wanting to do, or are you now just like pounding sugar on stage, for example? Like, you know, or how do you feel about that, or why are you doing that? If I'm going to do that, why am I going to do that? So, yeah.
Yeah, just to say that, yeah, we discussed that as well in some depth yesterday about kind of what we were doing physically, and you know how it differs as well. Like you already spoke about the fact that this was something that you developed out of like some research and then thinking about how you could approach the process, but that it wasn't a reenactment. And yeah, I think that's a really sort of like difficult sticking point as well when we were talking about like what do you do to kind of process things in private space, and what do you do when you're talking to a wider audience, and there's kind of, yeah, you have to be very responsible with the content that you're dealing with.
We spoke about that people didn't make sugar that way. Like I was at the Slavery Museum in Liverpool, which was surprisingly really good. I was very nervous about going there for a long time, and it was actually, I'm glad I went. But there's a big, like a, what did I call it yesterday? Like a train. You know, you have like a train mock-up thing. It's like on a table, and it's like a city, or in this case it was a plantation, but it was kind of like a mock size. And you see like the even on a mock scale, like it's massive. Like the plantation is like 40%, then you've got this massive mill. And it's, I'm talking like this thing was like from there to there, and even looking at the mill that size, I was like, whoa. Because that's not the bit really people talk about. People talk about cotton picking, people talk about sugarcane, but actually like people were dying in the mill, people were getting stuck in the wheel. Like when you make sugar, the liquid, because you have to, it's a reductive process, so you have to boil, and the heat goes up and it condensates in the roof and then drops on people's backs. Like that, like I'd never, like that is just such an intense like condition to keep working in. But for a long time I always thought about the field, and I think it was important for me as someone living now to get out of that psychology of like what it is that I think I'm doing and what actually I should be thinking about is a bigger process. Yeah. Does anyone want to speak any more to these questions, or do you think we should open up? Yeah, we're going to open up to questions. I think Amal behind will facilitate if anyone has any questions. Oh, right there.
What did you think about, oh, do I have to use the microphone? I can project. Okay. What do you think about the outcome of the sugar that you created? Do you have any feelings about like the thing that was created at the end?
The literal sugar?
Or the substances that you created at the end?
Okay.
I think it was interesting because we came out with 3 totally different outcomes. One of them was just burnt, because it got, yeah, that one. One of them was just nearly burnt, and the other one was quite caramelized. Yeah, and we all really loved that one, and it was kind of really happy. Like, we were really happy because we actually created something. We were like, wow, like this is really nice. So yeah, it was just really weird that we came out with 3 completely different outcomes.
Yeah, because after we made these the pots together, and then I made these last night once they cooled down. And maybe I have a little bit, and maybe because of that I have a different relationship to them, because putting them together was not pleasant, actually. It wasn't very nice. And yeah, like, but the thing is, they smell really nice in a way, but what I realized when all of this stuff was locked in a room, it actually started to smell like, I thought something was dead in my house. I'm just gonna be honest. Like I thought something had died, partly because there have been mice like everywhere in London. So I was like, maybe a mouse has died. So I kept looking around for it, and then I realized it was all of that. So there's something about like what is nice on a small scale. Like when I was in this room in my house, because we decided not to go all the way back to the studio. So I did it at home, and then my house just had this like dead smell, and I didn't anticipate that. And I think it's because the space was small. But I also found them beautiful. There's something about them, I was like, yeah, they're kind of cute. And I'm into it. And this one is nice because actually there's more sugar in it today than there was yesterday, because it's like a crystallization process. So this will just keep growing. And so when I came in this morning, I kind of felt like I was when I was a kid, like really nerdy and trying to grow crystals. And I was like, and it had grown, and that was really rewarding. Yeah, that was really nice. One till 5, 1 till 4:30. Yeah. I mean, like, I think one of the things about working in a structure like this, what I mean by a structure is Radical Kitchen, is that there was always limits, not limits in a bad way, just limits. There's a structure, there's a building, there's things, there's people, there's participants, so many things that you have to interact with that also help direct you. If I was trying to do this alone, to make these objects, I probably would do it over a week, because I would want a lot more sugar. And even I've just learned that, how much I would like need to do physically to get it done. Because you can see from the pots, like it's really coated the bottom. Like if I wanted to put that in there and it to just leak out, which is kind of what I want. I think when I saw it like that, I was like, no, I kind of want, like, something about that for me is attractive, then that would need to be full. So then I need to be doing this for longer, or I just need to like throw it in the NutriBullet. Like which one, how do I feel about that? Like, you know, or I'm gonna buy sugarcane juice online. And to think about like what's important to me. And right now I think what's important to me is the process over the object. So I would put the time for that. Yeah, I don't know, I think I've answered it. Yeah, okay. You can say no.
I guess I meant more physical.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's nice to think about a lot as well. But then at what point does your,
Yeah.
does your body start to feel like it's in a thing? Because it takes a while
To get the thing. Yeah.
And then to know that it is that you, that how much further you have to go to that you condition yourself. That, I guess
Okay, that is shift.
That's that shift that interests, like whether you feel the beginnings of that in the workshop.
I personally felt it when we were doing it together, because like by definition, almost rhythm is it connects people. It's like that's one of its like functions, right? So like there was something about that bounce, and then yeah, I think like when I perform, when I dance, like I don't think. That's one of the reasons I like it. It's just like poof, like oh, I don't know where she is. It's great. Like I love that feeling, and the beginning of that was there. Like I stopped thinking about trying to make sugar. I was just like doing the thing, and I think maybe that's the thing that, yeah, the turning point, like from practicality to like a physical experience.
And even just the contrast between doing the pounding versus squeezing the sugar cane, like the type of action the squeezing was very like, take big, at least for me, I was like breathing in and then like blowing out with the squeeze, and like there's no comeback from that. Whereas with the pounding, you're like, and I'm also a dancer, so I think that helped, like in terms of like how we were able to do that together. But you like are like breathing out, breathing in. Like there's a lot of like your body is like so you can like bounce from there to like bring back to the next like the next movement. Whereas with the squeezing, it was just like complete exertion into the sugar cane, which for me I couldn't ever get the same type of like physical satisfaction from. So yeah, that was like my limit as well. I couldn't really do that very well.
Oh yeah, sure. So the question was, how does my identity as being Tanzanian connect to this? I think potentially wrongly, but my Caribbean heritage for me is very strongly linked to sugar, and I see it that way. I don't think I really, and also maybe the reason I don't think about my dad's heritage in this story so much is because the Caribbean islands that I'm from, almost to a point of the fact you could say it's fact, but obviously we know with slavery there was a lot of destruction of documentation and so-called evidence. But it's almost known to be true that most slaves that went to Jamaica and Barbados were from Ghana and Nigeria. So even though I have a parent of let's say direct African heritage, it doesn't link back into my potential heritage of having enslaved ancestors. So I think maybe if my father was Nigerian, I might have a cyclical relationship to that. Whereas my relationship to my father is very much about coffee, and how that region was destroyed through the colonialization of coffee. I think where they come together is when the products are put together, which my research, let's say, doesn't get there yet. Like I like them in their raw forms. This is as far cooking as I've got to, so maybe I might get to the point of beverage if I want to bring my parents together. But yeah, I think I have quite a shift with that. I also do think a lot about South America and Tanzania, or like East Africa with coffee, because those places then had a big relationship. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
So I just want to ask, like, after going through that process, do you think it's changed your perspective on just like sugar and like the international sense? Like, so you talk about cooking, like using sugar and cooking. Has it altered how you use sugar and like putting sugar into food?
Well, it's only been a day, but yeah, I've been doing some kind of a lot of thinking about sugar myself in a lot of my work as well over the past sort of year or so, and as part of that I've been talking to a lot of other people about sugar and sort of histories of it, and also their kind of personal relationships to it. Yeah, and I think one of the kind of common things that I've got back a lot from those discussions is this kind of binary separation mentally between your sort of culinary experience that's entrenched in sort of British or European culture, and those sort of broader histories that also kind of frame why a lot of us are here and what sort of positions, yeah, countries sort of globally, economically, and there's sort of, maybe it's a sort of necessary in terms of like, yeah, dealing with trauma is a sort of necessary divide that we always put in place, because how can you be processing these things while engaging in the culture, which is also part of your culture, which is, you know, I don't know.
One thing that kind of brought me into the workshop initially as well was thinking about like the afterlives of slavery and how sugar has been, and maybe others can speak to this more as well, but how sugar, like why sugar, for example, is cheap? Like, why is sugar cheap to put into products, everyday products, and then how are those cheaper products demonized within certain communities in the sense that the government is like feeding your children sugary foods, going and getting fast food, whatnot, that's bad for you. And like just thinking about like the politics of cheap food and in contrast like healthy food and just you know, we were also talking a lot about the amount of sugar that's in Caribbean cuisine or like African cuisines, and why it's like so natural to add more sugar to things and how that affects black communities. But yeah, Zinzi, maybe you can say more about this, like the Caribbean communities in particular, with when we think about illness and diseases, and yeah, just that like messiness for me is really interesting in terms of like the present day afterlives of those histories.
I was going to say literally, basically the exact same thing. I was going to talk about the impact of sugar on specific bodies, like which bodies are more likely to be impacted by these sugars. We were talking about, as you were just saying, about us paying less for sugary foods while having to pay more for healthier foods which have less sugar in them. And we were kind of thinking about that, and I think you can speak more about what you were talking about, like diabetes and stuff yesterday, of what bodies were more likely to get these kind of illnesses.
So the end, some sort of end of this research will be a work that is currently called Type 2, which for those of you in the know is sugar-related diabetes. And people from Caribbean, and I keep making the distinction between Anglophone and Francophone Caribbean islands, because they do, and also Spanish islands, the culture it exists very differently, and then the similarities between those groups. Basically, whoever colonized you left residue. So and what that residue is, then kind of you can see it on a group of islands. So I want to be just very clear about where I'm talking from. I've never even been to a Francophone Caribbean island. So, but yeah, so people from like Anglophone Caribbean islands have a disproportionate propensity for type 2 diabetes, and to the extent that it's very common for people to have limbs amputated. Blindness is very common. Also, you know, people who have enslaved history, so have ancestors who were enslaved, will live less time. Like, my life expectancy is lower than my white peer, and that's just a fact. Like, and I think that, like, I really try to bring those points into the room, like when we're talking about race, I am going to die earlier. Like, so the idea that these conversations are not critical, like, there is nothing else to say. Like, there really just isn't. Like, this is an emergency. And I think, like, talking about, like, calling the piece Type 2 is talking about that emergency and talking about these, like, it's very difficult to have a conversation when people keep telling you it's no longer relevant. You know, David Cameron went to Jamaica and he was like, and he addressed the reparations leader at the University of West Indies. There is a department within the university at Jamaica that specifically focuses on reparations and trying to get a reparative justice for those people who were colonized. David Cameron went there and gave a speech and said, why don't we just drop it? Can't we just move on? And like, that's the leader of like the country that colonized those people. And I think it's really important to raise these things that are still very present about the residue and the aftermath of, other than the Industrial Revolution, like the most important thing that happened in terms of building the world we live in, which is like the Atlantic slave trade. Like, the world would look completely different. And so, like, talking about what's happening to our bodies, like, obviously I'm a dancer, so I'm body obsessed, like I am. Like, I think you should use the body to talk about what the body's going through, and that does excite me. But beyond that, I think there are things you can bring out that's happening to the body, like, that can help have those conversations. And I think diabetes is massive to begin that conversation. Yeah, I think that's it. I have a few. Most of them are articles which I don't remember the name of, but I can maybe give them to Amal, and they can be accessible. But the book that I do always remember, because I didn't print it off the internet, like I had to buy it, so I kind of remember the title more, is Zinzi Minott's Sugar and the Power. And it's an anthropological book. He's a food anthropologist, and in many ways it's like a really boring and difficult read. But like it's true. Like I didn't find it easy to read, and it's not like he's not writing from any particular. He's trying to be very objective, and so then he's not. It's not like it's very like monotone, because he's talking from like the history of food. But the thing that I did find really useful about it is it was clear. It was really, really clear and generative, and it kind of, it's the first book that I read that pushed me, like, it meant that I could go in all these directions, whereas I think some of the other books, I already had to have had a decision, because they were so leading. Then it was like, it was very clear that this book was written by Marxists, it was very clear that this book was written by the Black Power movement, and that was fine for me, but I think maybe that's a different thing from finding out the history of sugar, if it's not written as a history book for me. And I think that one was really good, and it's cheap. So probably we have time for one more question. Yeah, I can, but I'm going like that because now I'm dealing with all of this information that I have to figure out. Maybe it's changed my mind in some ways or added things. But it will eventually be a performative work, which will have these in, that will have sound and dance, and probably a filmic element. It will be very big, take up a lot of space, it will smell very strong. And like I'm thinking about scale and deniability. And I'm like, how much sugar do I have to pour in the room for you to just say okay? Like I'm kind of thinking about scale in that way at the moment, which is a little basic in a way, but I'm into it. And I think more I'm thinking about process than the thing at the moment, because I have an idea of what I want it to look like, but then yeah, I mean, when you pour sugar into a thing, you see how quickly it disappears, and you're like, oh god. Like both of these have like 12.5 kilos in each. It's a lot of sugar, you know. So I think I've got more to figure out, and it needs a home. It's not going to be something that's going to move very easily. So yeah, but at the moment I think I'm still kind of processing some information. So maybe just stay tuned. Yeah. Cool. Thank you.